How's it going, guys? It's John here from Hot Take Hockey to give you the Stanley Cup 2019 Contenders and Pretenders edition. So in this video, we'll talk about Stanley Cup contenders, playoff contenders, wildcards, and pretenders in general. So let's start from the bottom with pretenders. And I've got the Dallas Stars, the Colorado Avalanche, the Montreal Canadiens, and the Minnesota Wild. So we could also slot in the Vancouver Canucks, Edmonton Oilers, Florida Panthers, Chicago Blackhawks in this conversation. But these are the four teams that are most likely to make the playoffs or at least be close to it. You could also throw in the Arizona Coyotes, but the Arizona Coyotes I would also have as a wild card just because of their depth and actually the surprising team they've brought to the table. So with the Dallas Stars, you're led by Sagan and Jamie Benn, but besides that, your depth is lacking. Your goaltending is okay with Ben Bishop and Khudobin, and then your defense after Lindell and Klingberg really lacks in that second and third pair. With the Colorado Avalanche, you're honestly running on your top line. You could argue Soderberg, you could argue Kerfoot. Essentially, the Colorado Avalanche are running on their top six or top star players, and that just doesn't get you far. It gets you into the playoffs sometimes, but it doesn't get you to a Stanley Cup win. The Montreal Canadiens, again, another situation where they're overperforming, they're overachieving, and a lot of players and teams are really impressed with what they've been doing, especially led by Carey Price, Shea Weber. They have been showing that they can be top six players in Jonathan Drouin and Max Domi. With Minnesota Wild, trading away Charlie Coyle and Mikael Granlund isn't really a Stanley Cup direction. I can see this team sneaking into the playoffs, but would they do anything? Not really. I have them as pretenders. Now let's talk about the teams that I have as wild cards going into the playoffs. The Philadelphia Flyers, the Columbus Blue Jackets, St. Louis Blues, the Carolina Hurricanes, and the New York Islanders. Starting with the Philadelphia Flyers, who have been out of playoff contention for almost a year, are now looking in on the playoffs, really close for an opportunity to get there, and with a stacked team on paper that I believe should have been a playoff team from the start. They're led by Sean Couturier, Claude Giroux, Jakub Voracek, Nolan Patrick, James Van Riemsdyk, Travis Konechny up front. The list goes on. On the back end, yeah, it drops down. Shane Gostisbehere had a horrible year for his standards. Provorov is still a very underrated defenseman who could develop into a top two. And their goaltending, Brian Elliott, the emergence of Carter Hart, and the addition of Cam Talbot, who actually could be kind of underrated, and we've seen some success with him in the past. The Flyers, for me, are a really good team. They just need to figure things out, and they could possibly go into the playoffs and maybe win a round. At the end of the day, they probably are the more skilled team on paper, but with teams like the New York Islanders and the Carolina Hurricanes coming out of the Metro Division, these two teams have been shown to be in either division spots or wildcard spots throughout the year, and at the end of the day, their depth definitely doesn't lack compared to the pretenders. You've got goaltending that's been stellar on both sides. The Hurricanes, you could argue, but with McElhinney and Mrazek, you weren't expecting a lot, and both goalies have been above average. And for Robin Leonard with the New York Islanders, he's been ridiculous, and if this guy can carry that into the playoffs, then the Islanders not only become a wildcard team to win a series, but possibly a playoff contender. And with the St. Louis Blues and the Columbus Blue Jackets, the Blues have struggled most of the year, but now, throughout the last month or two, they've come out of hiding. Tarasenko's the guy we were waiting for him to become again, and guys like Pietrangelo came back from injury. Jake Gallen's playing solid. Jordan Binnington has been a huge surprise, and it's definitely looking like the Blues could be a wildcard team to win a series or two. The Columbus Blue Jackets are a team I could see being the LA Kings of their Stanley Cup run. They could sneak into a wildcard spot or even that third division spot and possibly go deep into the playoffs. I'm not saying they're going to win a Stanley Cup, but that's exactly why they're a wildcard team for me going into the playoffs. They could definitely win a round or two and be that underrated team just because of their standing position. But if you look at that team on paper, they're the most stacked. The only thing I would consider with the Columbus Blue Jackets is they have had some issues in their locker rooms, more specifically with Artemi Panarin and Sergei Bobrovsky. Let's look at the playoff contenders. The Toronto Maple Leafs, the Boston Bruins, the Vegas Golden Knights, the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the Nashville Predators. These teams not necessarily are Stanley Cup contenders right now, and I'll explain why some of these teams aren't, but they're definitely playoff contenders to win a round or two. I'll explain why for each team. The Boston Bruins could definitely be Stanley Cup contenders. Why they're not Stanley Cup contenders is because they have to get past Toronto and Tampa Bay, and vice versa with Toronto. For Toronto, they have to get past Boston and Tampa Bay. The fact that these two teams have to go past two top five teams in the NHL is ridiculous, and that's why these two teams aren't Stanley Cup contenders. I would definitely have these two teams in that conversation if not for the situation of the playoff format. We'll talk about that in a different video, and I think we can discuss them as Stanley Cup contenders, but I have them in this section because one of these two teams between Boston and Toronto are most likely, unless things change, out in the first round. The Vegas Golden Knights are playoff contenders more because I still think they lack experience. on the back end. And last year, they were driven by Marc-Andre Fleury. They could be Stanley Cup contenders as well. I mean, last year, obviously making it to the final, and this year their forward group is more skilled. So they could be in that conversation. I have them as playoff contenders. They definitely could win a series or two, and I definitely could see them going far again. The Pittsburgh Penguins are definitely being overlooked this year. I think they have taken a step back, but you can never count out Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, and I think they're definitely still a top 10 team in the league. I have 5 playoff contenders here, 5 Stanley Cup contenders, and the Pittsburgh Penguins are there in the top 10. And the Nashville Predators. The Predators have one of the best defenses in the league. They have Pekka Rinne in goal, and now with the additions of Wayne Simmons and Mikael Granlund, they have one of the most balanced and now a really skilled top 6 forward group. So the Nashville Predators are a playoff contender. I see a couple Western teams ahead of them, and that's why they're not Stanley Cup contenders. But right now, they're definitely the 4th best, in my opinion, in the Western Conference, and they could be right there with Stanley Cup contention as well. And let's move on to the Stanley Cup contenders. The Tampa Bay Lightning, of course, San Jose Sharks, the Washington Capitals, the Winnipeg Jets, and the Calgary Flames. So those 5 teams right there, it's no question. The Calgary Flames have been at the top of the Pacific. The Winnipeg Jets have been either 1st or 2nd best in the Central. The San Jose Sharks right there with the Flames at the top of the Pacific. The Washington Capitals have been 1 and 2 in the Metro, and the Tampa Bay Lightning have been long ahead of the Atlantic Division and the NHL. So it's obvious. The Lightning, led by Kucherov, Point, Stamkos, Vasilevsky on net, Hedman on the back end, along with McDonough, Sergachev, Strawman. It's become ridiculous. This team is so stacked. You have to have them as your favorites to win the Stanley Cup. You could argue San Jose, who's there. You could argue Capitals for a back-to-back. The 2 Western teams, the 2 Canadian Western teams in Winnipeg and Calgary are right there as well. I think the depth from all these teams, and you look at them, there's not one of those 5 teams that don't have a good defense group. All 5 do. All 5 have a really stacked top 4. All 5 have a really stacked top 6, and most of those teams right there have a really stacked center depth, more specifically the Lightning, Sharks, and Capitals. And none of these 5 teams, except for maybe the Calgary Flames, are weak in net. You could also argue the San Jose Sharks, but I'd say the Sharks tandem's more solid than the Flames. I would definitely take Jones and Dell into the playoffs over Rittich and Smith. But Smith has shown more signs of playing well. Rittich has struggled in some games, more specifically when he got crushed by the Leafs. But for the Capitals, Braden Holtby, the Jets, if Hellebuyck plays well, and the Lightning and Vasilevsky. So those are my Stanley Cup contenders. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, a discussion video to talk about contenders, pretenders, and everything in between. We'll see what happens in the 2019 Stanley Cup playoffs. If you have not yet, subscribe to the channel, drop a like. This was John from Hot Take Hockey. Hope you enjoy. Peace out.